From Super Nanny to the NHS and probably even your school, rewards and punishments are the go-to method for managing a child's behaviour. But have you ever noticed that they don't actually work? So why are we still using them? Welcome to the Sen Parent Survival Guide podcast, your guide to the special educational needs parenting maze. My name is Esther Freeman and I teach parents the principles and techniques that help my daughter go from 5 or 6 meltdowns a day to virtually 0. Every week on this podcast, I'll be sharing some of those tools and techniques so that you can have a calmer family life. So make sure that you subscribe wherever you get your podcast to make sure that you don't miss an episode. Now, I'm approaching rewards and punishments today because I know that it is a hot topic, and what I want to do is debunk some of the myths around them. So what I want to start with though is just share a bit of my own experience, because like many other parents, I used them with my daughter when I first became a parent. I used rewards to encourage potty training, to encourage her to go to the dentist, she hates the dentist, and to help with bedtime issues. Now, what I found was their success was either 0 or minimum. So with potty training, it was nothing. It just didn't work at all. And in fact, it took me over a year to potty train my child. And I know now that my daughter has sensory processing difficulties, and what I suspect was going on is that she was struggling to feel when she needed the toilet. I think that anxiety also played a part, because however many years later we are now, we still have a lot of toileting issues that are caused by anxiety. So having a bunch of stickers on the chart was never going to work. Then we get to the dentist. She absolutely hates going to the dentist. It stresses her out so much. And I have used rewards to try and get her through the door. And yes, they do get her through the door. But it doesn't stop her being quite difficult when we get there. Non-compliant, avoidance. It doesn't stop it being a complete nightmare next time the checkup rolls around either. So really what I'm seeing with the dentist is that there's overwhelming anxiety. That means that any benefit from rewards is incredibly short-lived. And then finally with bedtimes, this was the thing that made me realise that I just had to ditch this approach. So we were having a lot of trouble at bedtime, trying to get her to get into bed, really challenging behaviour around bedtime. And I remember once I offered some kind of reward. I can't remember what it was, if she would just do bedtime like she was supposed to do bedtime, how I wanted her to do bedtime. And I could see she really wanted this reward, and so she tried really hard. But the fact was, bedtime is enormously stressful for her for multiple different reasons, which I'm not going to go into right now, but it's a huge time of stress for her. She wanted to do the right thing, she couldn't because of her anxiety. And seeing this, I was then aware of this difficult position that I was in. If I said she couldn't have the reward because she hadn't done what I asked, I was going to put her in a place of shame, and it was going to rupture our parent-child attachment, because I could see that she had wanted to do it. But if I gave her the reward because, well, she tried, how was that teaching the right behaviour? It was then that I decided I was ditching rewards, and also I was ditching consequences for other reasons that I will come on to. And I was adopting a relationship-first approach. And I've got later in this podcast 6 points of how you can manage a child's behaviour through a relationship-first strategy. So let's just try and unpick some of this. What is it about rewards, and why do they work? And if not, why? So I know this question comes up because Some parents have already come round to this thinking that actually rewards and punishments don't work and they're doing something else at home, but maybe the school is still insisting on using rewards and punishments, and the parent can see that this is really counterproductive, so they're going and speaking to the Senko, and the Senko isn't listening. I've also heard recently someone was talking to an educational psychologist and said we don't use rewards and punishment, and apparently the educational psychologist looked very bemused at why the parent would say this, but there isn't evidence to show these work, and in fact the evidence shows the complete contrary. Now, if you are in this situation, I thought I'd put this video together in the hope that it might help some of you. Either you can show the Senko or whoever you're working with this video, because I'm bringing together the research that shows why they don't work and what other things you might like to do instead. They may not watch a video, you may want to just go in and summarize what I've said, that's fine too. But I will warn you that I have this theory that there are two types of teachers. There are teachers who are very open and willing to learn and willing within that parent-teacher relationship to find different ways of supporting a child. For those sorts of teachers, this video will probably be quite useful. There's another type of teacher who just basically thinks they know it all, and whatever you say to them, they're not going to change their mind. If you have that kind of teacher, you might want to be asking yourself some bigger questions about whether this is the right school for your child. There is actually, I think, a third category, which is that first teacher, that open-minded and willing to learn teacher who is currently under huge amounts of stress because of the catastrophic cuts to schools' budgets, the number of children that they're trying to support, many of whom don't have EHCPs, and they don't have the additional learning support systems and other things that they had in place prior to the budget cuts that would help managing those children better. I have sympathy for this group of teachers because I think they do want to learn and change, and just the environment that we're in politically at the moment is making that very hard. But still, go and speak to them. Let's talk about the evidence. Let's debunk this whole thing about rewards and punishments, because actually there's no cost involved in changing this strategy, and the benefits can be huge. So I want to start off with a piece of research called the self-determination theory that was developed by Edward Deci and Richard Ryan. So they say that there are two different types of motivation. There's inner motivation, which they call intrinsic motivation. That's something that comes from inside you. And then there is outer motivation, that's extrinsic motivation. And that will come from outside you, for example, from a teacher. And what their studies have shown is that intrinsic motivation is much higher quality than extrinsic motivation. So basically what that means is the motivation that a child has inside them is going to encourage them to learn far more than any external pressure that is put on them. And I really related to this. This absolutely made sense to me because of my own experiences in school. When I was quite young, I loved stories. I loved to read books. I loved to write stories. I had a big creative imagination and I loved to disappear into other worlds. And I was good at both as well. I was reading above my age range and I was always writing stories. I'd write stories in my spare time. And then I don't know when it exactly happened. I think it was somewhere around adolescence. And suddenly the motivation to read and write changed because it was all about GCSEs, and I suddenly had these books that I had to read, and I had to read them because I had to get GCSEs because it was important for my future. That extrinsic motivation basically killed my love of literature. I'm going to say something a bit controversial here. I don't like Shakespeare, I don't like Dickens, and they completely dominate the English curriculum. So I was screwed. I did it and I got my GCSE and I did quite well, but I don't think I read again for years afterwards. I just stopped reading. I went from loving it because it was intrinsic to me to having this extrinsic motivation and just hating it and just stopping doing it. I was well into my 20s before I found my love of stories and reading again. And now I love it again because, again, it's coming from inside me. And I wonder if you could take a moment to think about, can you relate to this idea? Is there something that you find that internally will motivate you to do something, and when there's that external pressure, it can actually put you off? Maybe the sun is shining and you look outside and just think, gosh, I'd like to go out and have a run today. But maybe when your doctor says you're not doing enough exercise, you need to run more, are you as likely to do that? Think about your life, and this is important because if we can relate it to our own lives, it helps us understand where our child is coming from, because they're actually no different from us. Yes, they're smaller and their brains aren't as developed as ours, but actually this intrinsic and extrinsic motivation is the same for all human beings. So there is another study that was done in 2021 by Howard et al. And this was a meta-analysis study. Now, if you don't know what a meta-analysis is, it's basically when researchers gather together lots of different studies on the same subject. And the question of rewards and children, particularly young children, has been studied extensively. So what Howard et al. Did was they pulled together over 344 studies into rewards. And what they found was that using these extrinsic rewards like you find in schools, and they were particularly looking at schools, they found that it did not improve quality or performance of the child. And actually, worse than that, they said that it could threaten well-being. So I think that's quite a powerful study, because when I was looking at all these different studies, I did find some research that said they do work. But when I actually really looked into it, some of these studies were with quite small numbers of people, like below 100. And actually, when you look at these meta-analyses, what they're doing is they're saying we're pulling all these studies together. Some will say it does work, some will say it doesn't. But overall, what these studies are saying is that they don't work. So this is what we're finding with all children. Rewards are ineffective. If you do see some benefits, they're going to be short-lived. There is one other study that I want to mention, and this is one that I found cited by Dr. Gabor Mate, who is a leading psychologist, and he's actually Canadian, but he talks a lot about studies in America as well. And this is called the magic marker study. And the way this study worked was that they had 3 groups of children and they gave them all magic markers. Now, with the first group of children, they said, you can do what you want with the magic marker, but they didn't offer a reward or anything. They just said, do what you want with the magic marker. The second group of children, they gave them a set task and offered them a small reward. The third group of children, they gave them a set task and they offered them a big reward. Then they came back to this same group of children a little while later, gave them all the magic markers again, and then said, you can do what you want. And what this study showed was that the groups that had rewards were not interested in the magic markers at all. And the group that were most interested in the magic markers were the ones that hadn't been offered a reward but were just allowed to do what they wanted with them. So this shows again that that intrinsic motivation is so much higher quality than the external motivation. So that is rewards amongst the general public, most of whom will be neurotypical. Now, if we add in neurodivergent children to this mix, we see those same results, but like on steroids. So let's take autistic children to begin with. Rewards are socially motivated. There's a social interaction that is key to the implementing and receiving of the rewards. Now, we know lots of autistic children, feature of the condition is that they really struggle with social interactions to the extent that can actually be quite stressful for them. So if we are using a system that is reliant on social interactions for autistic children, not only can it not work, but it can actually be unpleasurable for them. So you're actually having the opposite effect that you want to have. If we now add in children with ADHD, remembering lots of children have ADHD and autism, very common to be found together, we see even more negative results. So the reward system is basically based on when you give a reward, you get a surge of dopamine. This is the pleasure hormone. So you give a reward, you get a surge of dopamine in the brain, and that's why you may see this short-term benefit. But with children with ADHD, their release of dopamine is different. It often comes out much slower. And so therefore they won't get this surge and they won't feel the benefit, and so they won't see the motivation for doing something for a reward. And then they may have that behaviour interpreted as being willful or stubborn or whatever, but actually it's just a different neurological process for them. So rewards, we can see that they don't work well in the general public. They work even less well amongst children with neurodifferences. So let's now move on to punishments or consequences. Now, I think consequences is just a fluffy word for punishments. I think actually consequences are a form of punishment. And we generally talk about, if you've been on a traditional parenting course, you may have heard of logical consequences and natural consequences. Now, let me explain, because even if you have heard of these, they often get muddled up. So logical consequences are something that you plan. So your child has done something that you disapprove of, and you plan a way to punish them. And ideally, that should be linked, but often people don't link them. So a classic example of that is your child has misbehaved just before Christmas, and you say, right, that's it, Father Christmas isn't coming to give you any presents. That's not linked at all. But you might say a more accurate logical consequence is child broke the TV, child's now going to have to pay for a new TV. That would be a logical consequence. So a natural consequence, in theory, is something that you don't plan. It just happens naturally. So for example, your child wants to go outside but refuses to put their coat on and it's cold outside. So the child would just go outside and get cold. That is the natural consequence. However, I think, first of all, people just get logical and natural consequences muddled, and so often I hear people say, what natural consequence would I give my child for doing X, Y, and Z? Well, if you're planning it, it's not a natural consequence. Natural consequences happen naturally without planning. But even when you use the example of the coat, a natural consequence can quickly turn into a logical consequence or a punishment. For example, your child has to take in a piece of coursework into school. You know your child has a bad memory and is likely to forget that piece of coursework, and you don't remind them. So you say, well, they're going to have to deal with the natural consequence of forgetting their work. And so they forget their work, they get the detention. But that's not really a natural consequence, because you know your child has this problem and needs support. And so actually you're imposing a logical consequence because you have planned not to support them. Another example, going back to the coat and the cold weather, this happens with me an awful lot with my daughter. She will say, I say, we're going out, take your coat. I don't want to take my coat, I'm hot. And I know probably as the day goes on, we're going out somewhere away from home. As the day goes on, she's probably going to feel the cold, especially if we're outside and sitting down somewhere having a picnic or something like that. I know she's going to get cold later on. Now, some might say that the natural consequence of my daughter not listening to me and putting her coat on is that she gets cold later. I actually think that's a bit mean. If we're in this situation, I put her coat in my bag because I know later on she's probably going to get cold. So we go out, she says, Mum, I'm cold. I say, okay, here's your coat. Because Otherwise, it is a plan to punish her for not listening to me. But I don't think that actually that is helpful, because all it will do is put her in a place of shame. She'll be cold. She'll be grumpy because she's cold. There will be tension between us because she knows that she hasn't listened to me when I told her to. She'll probably feel shame. And what are we achieving? A cold child, that's all. So I don't actually think some of these things that people say are natural consequences. The other thing about natural consequences is that they, or any type of consequences, is that they break the child-parent attachment. They cause a friction in it. And Dr. Gabor Mate, who I mentioned before, he talks about using time out as a consequence. Say your child has had a massive meltdown and you use as a consequence for that, you have to go and sit in time out for however long. Now, time out is particularly problematic because what you are doing is you're using the threat of fear of abandonment from an adult on which the child relies for their survival. So a human child, particularly in the very young children, are dependent upon their parent for survival. They can't survive without us. And so we build this very special attachment between us because we have to show them that we are there for them unconditionally and they can rely on us for their survival. And that is what creates this secure attachment, a sense of safety, a sense of belonging, and knowing that they will be looked after. When we put them in time out and say, no, you're by yourself, you're alone, I'm not going to be with you, you cause a rupture in that. You are using the fear of abandonment to get them to do what you want. And what Dr. Gabor Mate says is the limbic system, which is the part of the brain that manages our emotions, it just can't stand this pressure. And what you will find is that a child will shut down their feelings. So if you say, well, I've used time out and it worked, my child was quiet and compliant afterwards, yes, that's because they have shut down their feelings. They can't bear to feel the abandonment, so they've just shut it down. You might also get the defiant child who goes, whatever, I don't care. Again, they are shutting down their feelings. So what you are doing with time out is you're causing a fear of abandonment that leads to the repression of feelings, not a change in their behaviour. Or there is a change in their behaviour, but it's surface, and what is going on underneath is fear of abandonment. And actually, a lot of these consequences will be based on fear of what will happen now that I've done the wrong thing. And this can be particularly problematic for any child who has problems with emotional regulation. It's putting so much pressure on that limbic system for them. And children, neurodivergent children, children with autism, ADHD, they all have problems with emotional regulation. And this consequences, the fear of abandonment, threat, all of this is just putting huge pressure on them. I also want to talk about another condition that you may not have heard about, but actually affects large numbers of children. It's called fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and it is caused by exposure to alcohol in utero. And it doesn't have to be much alcohol. It could be just a glass of alcohol before you knew that you were even pregnant. It can still cause damage. It is a spectrum. It affects some children far more than others. It's very complex. It all depends on the time that you had the alcohol. One glass of alcohol can actually do more damage if it's at those very early stages than several glasses of alcohol later on. The general rule is there is no safe alcohol during pregnancy. And it is estimated that there are actually more children with FASD than autism and ADHD combined. They estimate it's around 20% of the population in total. Unfortunately, it's very hard to diagnose because there is a stigma attached to it because parents are worried that they're going to be blamed. And it's also complicated to get a diagnosis. I won't go into it all, but the diagnostic process is quite complex. And so there will be lots of children, and I'm saying this more to the teachers, really. If you are a teacher in a classroom, you probably have children in your classroom, statistically speaking, who may have been affected by alcohol. They're probably not diagnosed, they probably don't know it, their parents don't know it, nobody knows it, but they could be affected at some level by alcohol. And if they are, one of the things that alcohol exposure does is it damages the part of the brain that can link cause and effect. So these children cannot make a link between behaviour and consequence. I do this behaviour, I get this consequence. They simply can't link those two things. Also, children with FASD have problems with memory. It is not the only condition that has problems with memory. There can be other types of neuro damage that can lead to problems with memory. If you have a child who has problems with memory, they may not remember that when I do this behaviour, I get this consequence. They've just forgotten. So again, it won't help those children. And finally, any child that has any kind of sensitivity, maybe they've experienced some kind of disruption in their childhood, could be anything from a divorce to ending up in care. These children may be very sensitive, and the use of consequences is a shame-inducing technique. And some children can tolerate shame much more than others, but if you have a child who's experienced what we call a big T trauma, which might be something like physical abuse, to a little T trauma, which might be bullying, other kind of school stress for autistic children, for example. If you have a child who's experienced any kind of big T or little t traumas, then consequences can be incredibly shame-inducing, and you're only going to erode their self-esteem even further. That is why I do not use rewards anymore, and I do not use consequences anymore, unless it really generally is a natural consequence. The other day, this is an example of a really natural consequence. The other day, for some reason, my daughter decided to put her tablet in the bath. Don't know why, she thought it was funny. I think she was showing off in front of friends. I was so angry, so angry. And I was tempted to use a consequence with her, but it was because I was angry with her. And when I actually went away and I processed my anger, I came back and I remembered she is probably not going to remember this cause and effect. And we're not going to change the situation. So I just said to her, please don't do that again. It was a very silly thing to do. I'm now going to go to the shop and I'm going to try and fix your tablet by buying some rice, and I'm going to put your tablet in the rice and hopefully that will fix it. And she said, well, what happens if it doesn't fix it? And I said, I don't know, because at the moment I can't afford to buy you a new tablet. That is just the honest truth. You won't have a tablet for a while. I will have to find some money from somewhere, save up, whatever. We'll make cut back somewhere else. And then we can get you a new tablet. So the natural consequence was that if the rice didn't work, she would be without a tablet for a while. And that's because simply that wasn't planned. I couldn't do anything about it. That was just the situation we were in. So that is a genuine natural consequence. So what do I do if I don't use rewards and consequences? So I mentioned right at the top that I use a relationship first approach. And I've got 6 relationship first tactics that I'd like to share with you now to help you give up the rewards and consequences and find an approach that puts your relationship with your child at the center of all behavior management. So the first tactic I use is praise. So instead of rewards, I use praise, and I make sure that that praise is really specific. So if your child comes to you with a picture and you go, oh, that's nice, lovely, that's not specific praise. If my daughter came to me with a picture, I would say, that's lovely. I really like that bird you've drawn. It's really realistic. And look at the colours. They're beautiful. Oh, you've used that red and green so nicely together. So praise does help build a child's esteem. And if you give regular praise, then it will do far more than a reward will ever do. So praise, that is the first one, specific praise. The next strategy is, instead of time out, I use time in. Time in is when your child is having a meltdown. Instead of sending them off to sit on the naughty step, you find a safe and quiet space and you sit with them. Now, what you do while you're sitting with them is help them manage their emotions so they're brought down to an acceptable level. But you're always with them in the moment, working with them to help them reach that goal. They're never alone. So the ways in which you might help them bring down their emotions are different depending on how dysregulated they are. So if they're really dysregulated, I would just sit with my daughter and just say, I can see you're really upset. I'm going to sit here, and when you're ready to talk, I'm here for you to talk to. So some of you might say, yeah, but when my child has a meltdown, they're really violent. Well, one thing you might do is have a massive cushion, and when you can see them working up into that meltdown, you would say, is this a big cushion moment? And then you get your big cushion and you hold it in front of you and you say, I'm going to stay here with you, but I'm going to use this cushion to protect myself because violence is not okay. And you may move away from them slightly to just keep yourself safe, but you would still stay in the general space with them. If they're not a little less dysregulated, you might want to do something like colouring in. This helps bring back the frontal lobe. It helps bring that back online if we engage that frontal lobe. So colouring in, or if they are really dysregulated, give them a big bit of paper and just say, just scribble, or tear paper up, something like that. You might want to use fidget toys, or I like that plastic bubble wrap. You can get them to pop that. So you might have we have this little stress bag, and there's a bunch of activities in there that my daughter can do when we're doing time in. And this brings me on to the next point. The third point is, after the behaviour that you don't want, when everything's calmed down, you do what we call a deferred conversation. So you would say, earlier today or yesterday, you had that big upset and there was behaviour there that wasn't really okay. And I want to talk to you now about why that happened, what led up to it, and how we might do things differently next time. And work with your child to think through strategies. You might want to do a role play. So maybe it was like a fight between siblings. Oh, well, he said this and she said this. And so you could role play how they might manage that behaviour better. And so that is the deferred conversation. My next point number 4, is role modelling behaviours for them. So that might be showing them what you do to manage your mental health. And that might be things like tapping. I use tapping on a daily basis to help me stay emotionally regulated, because I know if I'm emotionally regulated, my child is more likely to be emotionally regulated too. Tapping is a mix of the ancient Chinese tradition of acupuncture with Western psychotherapy. It takes less than 10 minutes to do, and the results are almost instantaneous. Instead of using the needles that we would use in acupuncture, we actually use our fingers and we tap on various parts of our body. And as I said, we recite statements while we're tapping. And this sends a message to the brain that we are safe, it's okay to calm down, and it's okay to think straight through the problem that you're having. So you can use it on yourself, You can use it on your child. As I said, I've got some free resources on my website. I will link to them in the show notes if you want to give tapping a go. Other things you might want to do is a bit of yoga, healthy eating, of course, healthy sleeping. These are all things that you can show that your child that you're doing to role model the behaviour that you want from them. So that is point 4. Now the next point is about listening and validating. So we talked before about having that deferred conversation. When you're having that deferred conversation, listen and validate your child's feelings. Don't try and fix things necessarily. I have a video about the drama triangle, which I'll link to in the show notes. And this explains how we have more success when we just listen and validate our child's feelings rather than trying to fix them. You don't need to fix things for them. Teenagers particularly, they say mostly what they want is just to be heard. So when your child is doing this behaviour you don't want, you might want to ask them why they've done it, and then just listen about the frustrations that led them to that behaviour. And then, as we said before, this isn't fixing, but you could talk about things you might do differently next time. I'm not going to promise they'll do them next time, but if you keep talking through other strategies that they can use instead of just blowing up or doing the thing that you don't like, whether it's breaking something or starting a fight, keep reminding them that there are other ways to solve problems. So the final point, point number 6, is going back to this idea of extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. Let's focus on using that intrinsic motivation to get your child to do the things that you want them to do. So for example, what are their interests? How can we link this into things like schoolwork? My daughter really struggles with her literacy skills, and at school she gets bashed over the head every day with phonics, and I cannot begin to tell you how many conversations I've had with her where she complains about her phonics lessons. I'm really not convinced it's helping her reading or writing. Me and the school have a difference in opinion on that, but I don't really see that it's working. I see that it causes her a lot of stress. But what I have noticed is that my daughter is very socially motivated, and when she wants to talk to her friends on her phone, she wants them to talk to her, she finds a way to read and write. She's been very creative in it, actually. She's discovered apps and things like that that help her with her reading and writing. So that's because she's motivated to do it, because she's very socially motivated. So she will find a way to read and write when it serves her. So think about things that you could do with your child's natural interests. For example, if you feel that your child is just stuck on a screen all day at home and isn't getting them any exercise because they just want to play computer games all the time, I discovered this amazing app the other day called Pokemon Go, which means that the children have to go out into the community to find their little Pokemon creatures, which means that they're getting out and exercising. I actually did it the other day when I wanted my daughter to come and walk the dog with me, and she was refusing, and I said, how about we go on a Pokemon Go route and the dog gets the exercise, you have some fun. And yeah, she came out with me, she loved it. So tapping into their interests, thinking, how can I link this to learning? It might be that your child has a big interest in medieval ships. I don't know, random. But, let's link this into history. Let's go and find out everything we can about medieval ships and, who are the people who are on them. Make it into a little project because it's their interest anyway. So they are going to be more motivated by that than sitting down and doing a worksheet about medieval history. So think about the ways that you can use these relationship first techniques to help manage your child's behaviour, keeping the parent-child attachment at the centre of everything that you do. And I think you will have more success with that than rewards and punishments. So now on to our final section, which is looking at stuff that's going on in the wider SEN world at the moment. So I've had a few sort of negative ones, but I want to end this week on a bit more of a positive note, because I don't know about you, but next week we'll be going into half term. I won't actually be putting a show out next week because of half term, but I'll be back in a couple of weeks' time with another episode. And so what I thought, I would leave you with something more positive than usual to guide you into your holidays if you are having them this next week. And so I want to give you a recommendation of something to watch. Maybe watch it with your children. It's on BBC iPlayer and it's called The Assembly. And it's with the amazing Michael Sheen, actor, activist. And he has put himself forward to be interrogated by a group of young people with I think they're autistic and learning difficulties. I think that's how they were defined. And they ask him everything from, do you like Superman, to why did you not accept an OBE? They're up in his face. They give him quite a grilling and he just handles it wonderfully. And it's a beautiful mix of different young people with different learning styles, different learning abilities, and it's just a really wonderful showcase, and absolutely full marks for Michael Sheen for putting himself out there. I did get a bit tearful watching it. It's very moving in moments, and all I can say is, wouldn't it be wonderful if one of the politicians that manages the budgets that give our children access support would put themselves forward for something like that? Maybe you want to tell me whether you think they would do that. I don't think they would. It'd be good if they did though. So give that a watch. It's The Assembly on BBC iPlayer with Michael Sheen. And I hope that you find that as enjoyable as I did. Take care. I've mentioned before the drama triangle and a video that I had made about that. If you'd like to check that out, just click here and you can watch that video and learn all about this really important psychological theory. I think it will really help you in your parenting.